Welcome, everybody. Good evening in Europe, a late good morning to everybody joining us in the US and beyond. And thank you for participating in our discussion series, Notes, Art and Tech Encounters. We are very excited to continue the discussion series with today's edition about a more than human tech. What does a more human and a more than human tech feel like, sound like, look like? I'm Diana J Nucera, Cultural Program Curator at the Goethe Institute San Francisco, and we are hosting this event as a member of the UNIC Cluster Silicon Valley. The event is part of the GRIDS and hosted by the Goethe Institute San Francisco. A few words about the context of the event. Notes is a series of talks that bring together artists, technologists, and researchers from the US and Europe and beyond to engage in a dialogue about the potential of interdisciplinary collaborations between art and technology. It was established within the UNIC Cluster Silicon Valley, which is a network of European diplomatic and cultural institutions. Dear everybody tuning in, we welcome your active participation in our discussion. Please submit your questions at any point during the conversation. We are more than happy to include them in the conversation. In this context, I'd like to point out the importance of a respectful way of communicating with each other. We are dedicated to provide a respectful, harassment-free and safe space for everyone participating in our events. I'm very honored and excited about today's guests joining us from Cape Town, Munich, Vienna, New Haven, Detroit, the Bay Area and beyond. Thank you so much for participating in this conversation. Before we delve directly in medias res, please let me introduce our moderator, Xiaowei Wang, who has also co-curated that edition. Xiaowei Wang is the creative director at Logic Magazine and the author of the book Blockchain Chicken Farm and Other Stories of Tech in China's Countryside. Without further ado, Xiaowei, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Bettina. And yes, thank you all for joining us today. Just a few notes, this event is being recorded and will be available on the GRID website. And also please join us on December 7th for another GRID event, the NFT Politics and Poetics event happening at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, with curators Valentino Catricala and Domenico Quaranta. I'm joining you today from the Bay Area, aka Ohlone Land, and I'm so excited for this multi-continental conversation to think about a more than human tech and a more human tech. Over the past few years, we've seen a growing techlash as well as critiques about these big tech platforms. But as scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore reminds us, it's really about looking beyond tools as objects, and we need to be asking who controls the conditions and to what ends are any tools wielded, and providing possibilities for us to actually build this perhaps new decolonial technologies. So for today, we have 4 presenters, and they will each present on their work for about 5 minutes. And then from there, we'll go into Q&A. We anticipate this conversation and this webinar lasting for about an hour, and we welcome your questions either in chat or using the Q&A button directly. So without further ado, we will have our first presenter, Dr. Kalindi Vora. Thank you so much, Kalindi, for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here and for including me in this conversation today. I'm just going to tell you a bit about the research that I do. So we know that racial and gender bias can be inadvertently programmed into algorithms or be lodged in the collection and preparation of the data that we feed those algorithms, or often both. So for example, we've seen bias in the outcomes of using large data sets to calculate who does and doesn't qualify for a loan in the US, and even what kind of loan they're offered. And this is because necessary hard data doesn't exist for people who, say, don't have stable addresses, don't have credit scores, and so forth. Or we see it in policing, where algorithms are used to calculate who's considered a criminal risk. But of course, these algorithms can cement historical data, biased historical data that represents racial profiling and xenophobia in its collection. So my own research has taken on the problem of racism and other social injustices that get built into technology by looking at how deeper sedimented histories of racial injustice inform the design imaginaries behind new technologies. And I think about this as a broader problem that's connected to, but also underlying these functional outcomes of bias in algorithms. So I've developed, I'm going to share some of my research from my 2 recent books. And then I also want to maybe in the Q&A talk a little bit about research trainings that I've developed to convey some of these histories to actual technology designers. So my current and former research projects explore how the design of new technology can inscribe histories of racial capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism into projected future social and material worlds through the technologies we design. So in my first book, pictured here, I think about how under the British Empire, racialized labor allocation around the empire informed the design of contemporary communications infrastructure. So to give you a sense of what I mean, I'm going to share a couple of maps. So to show how racial histories get mapped into the present of technology. This map is represents the maritime route of ships that were moving enslaved Africans who were captured and dislocated by force to Europe and the Americas during the period of the British colonial rule. And so in this map, the main technology of distribution was ships and shipping routes, which are represented here by the red arrows. This map is a map of contemporary submarine cables that are currently moving data, labor as data around the globe. So we're kind of looking at these maps together. The first transatlantic cables were laid in the 1860s for telegraphy, and trans-Pacific cables followed in the early 1900s. And so by the early 1900s, the British Empire had connected up most of the continents. These cables were later replaced by fiber optics cables, which we use today. And so the similarity between the 2 maps marks the way that the flows of labor and capital today build upon those logics, relationships, and material infrastructures of the colonial period, setting the stage for the map that underpins globalization and now the so-called casualization of labor. And this picture and article is from 2007. Looks kind of like how many of us have been working during the pandemic. But at the time, it was discussing the outsourcing of household work, here tutoring, to show how outsourcing by US and European corporations was then starting to really use overseas workers to artificially lower their labor costs. And part of the reason that outsourced labor was cheaper was that companies didn't have to pay any benefits to their workers. And so I use stories like this and others to connect that logic of colonial labor to outsourcing, and then outsourcing to the logic of automation and platform-based labor and labor distribution through apps today. So at that time, sort of 2007-8, data from what was a relatively new platform called Amazon Mechanical Turk was starting to come in. And for those of you who don't know, Amazon Mechanical Turk, or AMT, is a crowdsourcing labor platform. So this graphic represents a snapshot of data from 2010, and it's excerpted from an article by Ross, Zaldivar, Irani, and Tomlinson. And as you can see, most of the participants at that time were in India and the US, and a slight majority self-identified as female. And all this has changed now, but this snapshot moment shows how Amazon Mechanical Turk started within this tech imaginary and infrastructure of outsourcing, which I think is really important to track. And so this is the cover of my more recent book, Surrogate Humanity, which I wrote with Neda Tanaslawski. And we theorize here how racial capitalism and this US specific history of indigenous genocide, chattel slavery, xenophobia around immigration, and anti-Asian outsourcing imaginaries inform the design of machines that interact socially with humans. And so part of my work has been to shed light on the cultural assumptions built into foundational concepts like the concept of the human itself. And I also wanted to mention that I research projects that challenge what we consider the givenness of these concepts that we take for granted, the fact that they are just material facts, like the human or even intelligence. And I look at projects that challenge us from a feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial perspective. And I will pause there.
Thank you so much for that introduction to your work. And next up, I'm super excited to welcome Mother Cyborg, aka Diana Nucera.
Hi, nice to be with you all. I'm coming to you from Detroit, Michigan. And I'm going to share with you some of my slides. I just want to make sure everything looks okay. Great. So yeah, what I'll be sharing is just thinking about the work I've been doing in Detroit for the past 13 years, which has been working with local residents in fighting the digital redlining that's been happening here in Detroit. My work has always focused on merging access and agency to open up technology as a tool for individuals to build their neighborhoods, their city, but also the future that they want to live in. So what I'm currently working on are a series of quilts that kind of look at how does visual language help unpack the concept of community technology and assist in unpacking our complex relationships that we have with technology. So in using traditional craft and bright colors to examine these complex issues of our relationships with technology, I hope to open up like analog spaces that allow us to reflect upon our collective relationships with internet technologies, identity, legacy, and future. And so this quilt is called Mestizos 404. It's a very large quilt, it's like a queen size. If you're not familiar with the 404, it's an internet protocol that means that the place that your info is being that you're trying to access has been found, but you've been denied access to that information. And mestizos is a word that describes someone who's mixed race, especially one having Spanish and indigenous descent, which I do. And so this piece is about being a second generation and how assimilation destroys ancestry. And looking at 404 as a protocol within legacy, within identity, and just kind of unpacking that personal, interpersonal relationship that we have with technology and emotion. And here's some close-ups of the quilts that, try to unpack the journey of immigration and how that assimilation keeps us from, just understanding each other. This is another part of the 404 series. It's called 404 Mom. It's another large queen-size quilt, and it's about having an unavailable mother and the sense of loss that comes with the lack of access to your family ancestry. So I'm a queer woman of color that has not been accepted within my culture as queer. And so I have had a very hard time accessing my ancestors, and I'm from Colombia and from Sicily. So there is this interesting kind of hybrid thing that's like keeps coming up, and quilts seem to be a way to really unpack that. And here the 404 protocol really speaks to me in the sense of that, like, yeah, this information exists, it's here, but I have been denied access. So I'm using art to kind of unpack all that and figure out like what else is there. This one's called Encrypt Me. It's a smaller piece, and these quilts are part of a digital security blanket series that really look at how we kind of piecemeal the nature of privacy and security tactics used to protect consumers from surveillance. I do feel like VPNs, encryption tools, firewalls are all individual band-aids to like a very large collective problem of surveillance. And because the technologies of extraction are so deeply embedded in our lives, and these gadgets go unchecked and unfettered by laws, the concept of privacy and security to me is anarchism. Like it doesn't, it's something that is decorated almost. Like, so this quilt to me has my encryption key in the background. It also has a very, you know, like kind of mystical veil on it. And the idea is to kind of look at the theatrics that make us feel better about our choices. And this quilt's called "The Platforms Are Segregating Us." It's looking at how platforms, digital or analog, segregate us from making us impossible to see eye to eye. It's definitely reflecting upon the 2017 and 2020 elections here in the US, as we really saw the potential of social media to become a political weapon. And so it just, everyone keeps talking about holding these platforms accountable, but to me that's very terrifying and potentially a walk towards fascism. And so this is just sort of unpacking that. This quote's called "Infinite Data." And what this quote is like, looks at the infinite knot, which is a sacred symbol of love in many cultures. I think it's most identifiable in maybe Hindu, Buddhist cultures, as well as Celtic. I love that a symbol can mean love in so many different ways across our continents. And so this one looks at how surveillance is embedded in our culture and sold back to us through surface forms of expressing, such as likes, hearts, and emojis. And the fact that those likes, hearts, and emojis are the ones that are collected to understand who we are and what our predictive behavior may be. The big question that comes up to me as an activist and also as a consumer and producer of technology is like, well, how do you fight a system that commodifies love? And to me, the only answer is that we have to then love in much radically different ways. But in order to do that, I think that you have to look at the commodification of love and the self-worth that social media nurtures. And I'll just do this one real quick and then pass it on. But this is called "The Thing Inside of the Thing." I started reading, I finished reading 2 books that informed a whole series around surveillance capitalism and data criminalization. And specifically, those books were Shoshana Zuboff's "Age of Surveillance Capitalism" and Dr. Simone Brown, "Dark Matters." And those 2 really made me start thinking about all the ways in which these strategies of extracting data from us are very seamless and flawlessly designed, masked, and these functions are very convenient and they lead us to access. So it's like, how do you grapple with something that connects us, but also sort of puts our free will at stake? And so it's hard to decipher what to choose and what box is capable of capturing an individual. And so I started really diving into these concept of boxes and how, just like, is there a box big enough that could hold the self-determination? And is self-determination the only tool that we have to sort of combat this just monstrosity of a beast in front of us that is surveillance and digital extraction? Okay, well, I'm just going to go ahead and stop there because I'm sure I'm out of time, but there you are. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And next up, we have Dr. Valmont Layne. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning or good evening from where I'm sitting, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa, where I guess I've spent much of my career in a kind of curatorial role, in a developmental role. And now I curate special projects linked to the development of humanities at my institution, which is the University of the Western Cape. In a previous life, I was part of a team curating a community site in what was then in the 1990s, a pioneering program to return people to their land and to mobilize the concept of a museum in what was then, I think, fairly innovative and revolutionary ways. I think about it now because that particular intervention was, and especially low tech, even for the 1990s, it was all about people and the way they could hold on to things in quite a tactile engagement with an art installation that came to represent the land where they lived. Nowadays, I'm fortunate to be part of, to think about technology and the human from the site of an historically Black university in South Africa. It's interesting to note, just as a clue to why the university and the humanities program where I'm based is so interested in technology, partly because a growing body of research is showing the ways in which South Africa was not just a repository of racism. I think that is fairly well known, but that some of the earliest forms of racial science and racialized technologies around surveillance, around the mobilization of Black workers and for the mining industry and so on, occurred in South Africa in the late 18th, early 19th century. Hence, one of the angles of interest in the Humanities Center where I work has got to do with this question of the undoing of the concept and the practice of race, which has proven to be, even in South Africa, and frustratingly resilient. And we suspect that one of the clues to that has got to do with a connection between the practice and the production of race, or the reproduction of it, and the ways in which technology works to support the economy that it drives. The university was built as an apartheid project in the 1960s. So in other words, it was not meant to produce intellectuals and scholars. It was meant to produce the functionaries who would service what was at the time considered to be a segregated state bureaucracy, in which apartheid deemed people to be, wanted people to be governed according to a set of racial criteria. So what does it mean then to now be in a position to reinvent the humanities and to reorient the humanities through the prism of a university? As I said, this question is tied very strongly to legacies of race and to the relationship with the technical. The human itself is in question in such a discussion. In this vein, one thinks, and I want to suggest not so much about decolonization, because and I'll explain why later, but about restitution, about the idea that one wants to see the return, not so much about stolen property in the sense that restitution is now a big item on the global agenda, but to return to the kinds of values, to the human-centric community values that we hope would support and sustain a process of restitution. So there are two cores to my current project. One is the creation and the imagining of an arts program located from a Black university on the outskirts of town, inside the formerly white city of Cape Town. And we'll talk about that more if people want to know a bit more about it. And there are three key areas that we've decided to work with. One is around puppetry, another is documentary film, and the third one is sound and music. I'll stop there with that part. Another part of my work is a program to revitalize the archival and research collections of the university, which constitute the largest collection of liberation materials, liberation histories in South Africa, and one of the largest on the continent. The founding gift of this archive was the records of what was then the global anti-apartheid movement that started in the 1950s and came to an end, of course, when Nelson Mandela was elected. It became known as the Mayibuye archive, and that's quite interesting because the word Mayibuye refers to restitution. In other words, it's a slogan that people would have shouted during the struggle which people would have said Maibuye, or somebody would say Maibuye, and the audience would answer Africa. In other words, a desire to return to, or to bring about this process of restitution that I'm talking about. And one of the things that has fascinated me about the opportunity to build an archive has got to do with the fact that the archive today has got to be digital and it's got to be cloud-based. And so the construction of an archive and the kind of questioning about good practice and best practice around it has gotten me into a little bit of a rabbit hole thinking about, and it's interesting, I came across Kalindi's book on the digital, I think it was called Digital Surrogates, where one is thinking about the ways in which internet technology there's a kind of evangelism that we receive, particularly in the global south, particularly in South Africa, about the almost life-giving properties of data, the promise of data that it can solve all kinds of social problems on the one hand, and on the other, what seems to be an incredibly tenuous and fragile medium in which digital information circulates. So there's a bit of a paradox in the pervasiveness of data on the one hand, and the massive kind of arms race to produce more and more data and to, in a sense, process it and mobilize it inside the different technological flows that we have now. And on the other hand, the facts, and I think part of that is, before I end, just to say that it is also the kind of ontological, I think one of the speakers earlier, or the person just before me, mentioned the question about the kind of commodification of love, the commodification of human affect. There's a sense in which there's a profound ontological disconnect in what we have to deal with. And so in a sense, I'm interested in how one would go about building a practice, what I would call a practice of freedom, that would not, it would not be possible to reject any of these very scary or threatening technological edifices, but it would be important to find an ethical kind of practice inside of it that would enable us to do the things that we would do to make our world a little bit more humane and a little bit more just, in a sense. Now, I think I'll stop there with my sort of introductory comments, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much for outlining such crucial concepts. And finally, we have presenters from Grupa Laocoon, Moritz and Cosima.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. We're really glad to be here and among such interesting and fascinating speakers. Yeah, we are Laocoon. I'm Cosima, and Moritz Riesewig and Hans Block is missing. We are a cross-media artist. We do theater, documentary, audio plays, and even much more. And we're constantly asking ourselves the question of the digital age. What effects does it have on us humans? How can we interact with it? What is our political capacity to react to the digital world? That's also why we're called Laocoon, after the Greek myth of the Trojan horse. And we're trying basically to see into the Trojan horse, or maybe to be sometimes the Trojan horse, and understand what is in the black box of the black algorithm box. Our last project is called Made to Measure. And there we tried, we made the bet that we would be able to recreate the life of a person only based on their Google data. So European law permits us in Europe to get the data that Google has on you, and you just for this need to Google Takeout, and you can actually request some of the data they keep. And we had an open call, and we invited people, could you please give us your data? And we would, without even having seen you or met you, create a perfect double in the shape of a performer for your life and events of your life. And our bet was not just to find out the biography, but actually the complete personality. And through this experiment, we wanted to prove and see and be curious about what is this data? What does it say? Everybody's warning us about privacy and the necessity of privacy, but we always hear this comment of, well, I have nothing to hide. And this was kind of the motor for us. It was like, what do we have to hide? What does it actually mean to be so vulnerable on the internet? What's the things that companies have about us? And that's how we created Made to Measure. Now I will show you quickly a teaser, and maybe we can go back into the form and what happened actually. So here comes the teaser. Thank you. Moritz, do you want to maybe continue?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we ran this data experiment, and the first step was that we had a data analyst help us code an algorithm to scan the more than 100,000 data points which we found in the 5 years of Google data of this unknown person. And this algorithm helped us to make a semantic analysis of the Google search data of this person, which means that we found out which topics played a certain role in which moment of this person's life. And not only that, but also which topics evolved in the same moment, like what combinations of topics. To give an example, for example, health and esoteric content was kind of matching in a very dominant way. So we could kind of guess that the moments when this person looked for esoteric content on YouTube had something to do with her health conditions. And so this is just one tiny example of so many which show that only by the algorithmic analysis of this data, we were somehow capable of reading it or making it readable, which showed us that a normal person just getting the personal data from Google can never estimate how much you can actually find out based on this data by just checking it out personally. So that showed us that your freedom to get your personal data from Google or Facebook to see what they have on you, this is actually kind of limited very much because you don't have the capacities, you don't have the algorithms to actually then make correlations which only bring the information which leads so much further than just the raw data. And of course, we were also limited in the capacities we had in terms of algorithms, and our algorithms, for example, can't match the singular data with the data of the digital doppelgangers out there in the world. Like this is one thing companies like Google and Facebook do very often, that they build correlations between the singular data set and the data sets of which have certain similarities, and then they can find out things which are not actually written in the data themselves, and they can close gaps. What we did to close these gaps is something Cosima will now explain to you.
Yeah, we had the help of a performer actually, and the performer helped us to find out what the analysts couldn't, meaning she could actually play the digital doppelganger and fill in the missing pieces by her own life experience. So we put her in a situation, for example, we knew that our participant was working in a high stress, as a high stress pastry chef in a very fancy hotel. And we put her in this situation, and added the data points we had around this. And actually by doing the performance and understanding what feels right in this situation, she closed the data gaps. And this is how we worked out the biography of this person and her personality using research papers we inferred from her taste in music and films, the search phrases she used, what her big five ocean model is saying about her personality. And the doppelganger prepared a biography in the I form, which she presented in a meeting to the real person who was behind the data. So they met, we sent her an invitation. Of course, she knew about it because she accepted to participate in the experiment, but we sent her an invitation through Instagram advertisement by targeting her so precisely on the things she loved and liked that we tried to make sure that almost only her would see the advertisement. And we saw on how much we paid that I think like 20 people saw the advertisement in this little town she was living in. And there was a number like, call us if you recognize yourself. And that's how she first understood, okay, now I'm going to meet my double. We sat them together in a room and she listened to her double talk in the I form of her life for I think 2 hours, something like this. And yeah, I'm running out of time. Thank you for reminding me. It was such a complex project and we're not very good at telling it right now because we've coming fresh out of it. But I think that's the most important thing, this meeting and what happened between these two women. And the experience you can see on the website is actually one where the observer gets observed back. So while you're looking at the website, you get observed in return as an observer. Maybe I will not say anything more. And during the Q&A, I can add some information here and there. Thank you so much. Sorry for getting over time.
No, all good. I've learned so much from each of these presentations and wish that I feel like we need much longer for everyone. I invite the rest of the panelists to turn their cameras back on as we move to the Q&A section. There's so much to talk about, but actually picking up on this idea of the data gap and how there's both the purported power that these platforms can predict every move through data, as well as the actual gap, which comes from being and living in the world. And I think this really ties into, as Dr. Layne was saying, the practice of freedom, or as Diana put it, you know, in a system that commodifies love, how do we love differently? Maybe we can start off with well, how do we fight that system? What are some of the challenges or just, you know, challenges and really, you know, things happening on the ground as you talk to communities, as you build out digital infrastructure for communities, or as you're talking to designers of technology? Perhaps Kalindi or Diana, you could start.
Sure, I can definitely jump into there. Oh, that's the big question. What do we do, right? This is so crazy. What do we do? I have a metaphor that I can offer, and this I've learned from working with people on the ground here in Detroit. And we have the worst digital connections in the US, and we're a huge metropolitan city that has a big legacy. There's no reason for it other than the fact that we're primarily people of color in this city. And so first, you know, it's like the fight was to gain access. And then it's kind of like, well, what does it mean to give people access if they're going to be surveilled and deal with trolls and all this other stuff, right? So there's a lot of education around becoming a producer rather than a consumer that I think needs to be done, because there's, you know, my big question was around self-determination and love. And it seems as if the ways in which technology and data extraction has been fed to us has had us forgotten ourselves. But maybe that doesn't make so much sense when people grow up with it. So we're kind of in this middle place. So the metaphor I offer is, you know, if you spend the time, if you're looking at the beast as the first part, you have to understand its flaws, its weaknesses, its strengths, and all of that. But fighting it, I don't know if it's the right answer. I think that if you fight something that large, that's what your whole life is, and that's what the generations after you will have to do. So I'm really curious about the path around the beast, and what that takes at this point in time for not just people who are like really scholarly around this, but what for my neighbors. Like, I'm very concerned about my neighbors, because the subject matter affects everyone, but there's a conspiracy theory kind of vibe to it, that I think has to be unpacked and also addressed, and lots of education before we could even see that path illuminate. So that's where I'm at.
That's so helpful. And I just wanted to build on Diana, your offering of thinking about sort of affect and love, and bring it back to technology design, which was what I opened up. And I think we being everyone who uses technology, which is most folks, tend to think of the technologies themselves as neutral, as objects, and the kind of problem is the corporations behind them, or the ways that they're used. And so what I'm trying to do is actually add in also the fact that the technologies are not neutral. And an example of that, I think about how we take up, like how everyone put Uber on their phone before it was even out of beta mode. And then everyone was using this kind of new rideshare app before people had worked out the bugs or projected the social impact of this new practice, which was kind of, I will just say, a disaster. And so, when things get scaled before we've actually thought about impact and use and how they're going to affect different communities, for example. And so one example I wanted to share around this provocation around love and community is a project by a roboticist and artist, Kelly Dobson. I don't know if any of you know Kelly, who created this project called Machine Therapy. And it had several machines. She's trained at MIT and she builds robots. And one of them was meant to challenge the field of care robotics, where these different robots are being developed to be placed in the homes of elderly people so that they can live at home longer. But what the robots do is they just take biometrics like temperature. You can interact with a screen on the robot that says, are you in pain? Scale of 1 to 10, these kinds of things, can dispense pharmaceuticals and just do kind of basic interactions. But these robots are imagined to replace adult children, grandchildren, pets, right? And so the idea is like, we'll just give this robot to an elderly person living alone, and then everyone else can just evacuate. And Kelly understood that this is a potential infrastructure and will change how we relate to one another, how we care for one another. And so she created some machines to show the problem. And one of the machines, called OMO, is really interesting. And I don't have a lot of time, so I'll just say some of the things that are interesting about OMO is that it's not anthropomorphic. It's kind of this orb that you hold. And the model of, she says it's not an employee servant robot like these care robots. It's a interactive robot that encourages mutuality. So it's programmed with noise. So it's not always going to do what you expect. But the way it interacts is by expanding and contracting like a breathing creature. And because of our involuntary nervous system, any mammalian body will respond in terms of our breathing and heart rate to the motions of this machine. And so it can interact with us in this reciprocal way. And the noise means that it's not modeled on neurotypicality. And so it requires the interactor to accommodate this kind of subjectivity that's not predictable. And so I just think that some of these projects point out the danger of seemingly neutral technologies becoming infrastructure before we know it, that shapes how we interact with one another, how we care for one another.
Thank you for that. I will let other panelists chime in, and also in the meantime to the audience, feel free to drop your questions into the chat or using the Q&A button.
I mean, I just want to echo the point that I think Diana made about, I'm not sure if she used the word agency. It seems to me that it's not productive to fight something that is so pervasive. And so, I guess the question I keep coming to is, how can one reestablish a kind of viable agency in this set of relationships. And what does agency even mean when much of the kind of anticipatory dynamics in modern algorithms, in data algorithms, relies on kind of microsecond, millisecond timing. It's designed to make you, well, it's designed to extract what your next likely move is going to be. And so I think part of the question and Diana's point is very salient here, that it is about people being able to regain competency, the technical competencies, as well as the kind of, and I think it's both. It's not just access to the latest high tech, or in kind of trying to gain that, but in trying to understand where the points of agency are in that technology, and how ordinary people, and in a context like Detroit, and I guess the part of the world where I come from, we are probably in a similar kind of bind where there is little access to any new technology that comes along. It is a much greater process to try to get access to it. So for me, I think that is one of the keys. I think of I think it was a philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, who speaks about nomad science, the idea of being resourceful with limited resources and trying to find ways to access the agency that all technologies have. That's not an answer, but I think it's maybe perhaps a way of approaching a problem that might be productive.
I know I went already, but I love that because that just always reminds me of two turntables and a microphone. They were never supposed to go together, but when they did, it changed the music forever.
Yeah, I think it's we completely echoed all the sentiments you were saying, from producing, being your own producer, with a question we were rattling with by producing, and we were wondering, where do we put Made to Measure? Do we put it on YouTube, on a platform that already exists, or do we take the risk of putting it on our own platform, which also means that we will be hard to find, but because we feel the necessity, and that's something I think works well with what Kalindi was saying, the participant was creating traces on the internet. And these traces were saying so much about her. But of course, she had no choice but to create the traces she was creating, because she was creating them in a highly, highly designed place that was absolutely made for her to create these traces. So it became a self-fulfilling prophecy of, oh, you're really interested in body and the shape of your body. But of course, everything that was on these platforms was pushing her to be interested in exactly this. And you can see in the data over the 5 years, the struggle between impulses from the analog world and the digital world. And the analog world trying to come in and broaden the interest and the understanding of life, and suddenly being more curious. And you see some searches suddenly in Google coming up like, oh, what does this mean? I've never heard this word. But back, the suggestions of Google coming back, and the fight of trying to expand, and a digital world trying to reduce, because it's actually easier to control probably, and easier to give good impulses. And what you were saying, Valmont, about this milliseconds of deciding, and you are in a place where you actually reduce to your impulses and serves them so well, and everything that serves the dopamine is like, here, yeah, click here, click here, click here. And where's your chance to fight against that? How do you take back your agency? How do you understand that you have more possibilities, and that this is highly designed, and that there's more out there than just these spaces? Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Moritz, I didn't know if you had something to add as well.
I think everything Kuzma described.
Great. I want to ask a question in the chat, but maybe we can also answer it later. But this conversation between Dougal and, yeah.
Oh no, please go ahead, Cosima.
You want to answer it?
Yeah, I'll read out the question out loud. So a question from Valmont of hearing more about the 2-hour conversation with the double.
Yeah, that was on several different levels intense. Intense for us because, of course, we noted our responsibility for arranging all that. And it was indeed an experiment with an open ending. So we didn't know how the experiment participant would react on being confronted with all the things the double found out just based on the data from Google, and of course also filled it in with her own fantasy, closed the gaps by her own intuitions. So actually there were several moments when the experiment participant corrected her, and she thought the double was completely wrong, or we were completely wrong in analyzing her data. She remembered completely differently about these moments. And she argued about it, and she could kind of, she started kind of defending herself, which is also a moment which shows how much pressure this made on her to explain herself, which normally in the normal life you actually don't even have the chance to very often. Like very often you're like surrounded by narrations about seemingly yourself, recommendation algorithms producing recommendations, videos, pictures, content, which seemingly is tailored for you personally. And after a while, you notice that your behavior changes just based on this content, which was suggested for you, or you don't even notice that your behavior changes and you just adapt this behavior, which was seemingly tailored for you, but which was also tailored based on profit interests, of course. And then you make them true by behaving that way. But in the end, you never know if you just fulfilled the prophecy which was given to you by other reasons. So yeah, that was maybe the last few sentences. There was one specific moment in the experiment which really surprised us a lot and shocked us also, and shocked the participant. And that was a moment when she was shown the film of her life, so to say. And of course, that was already a provocative claim. And she then corrected a lot about the portrayal which she was shown. And she started to remember herself, and she wanted to tell us her version of her memories. And it was about a house she lived in. And she started including things into her own memories, which she was just told by the doppelganger the day before. So when she noticed that she did that, it was absolutely shocking for her, because like she couldn't even distinguish any longer between her real own memories and the things she was told by the doppelganger. And for us, of course, that was like a moment we all said, okay, let's stop here. That leads too far. We will end this experiment at this point. But at the same time, of course, that was a moment when everything was like becoming visible, what normally never becomes visible, because you can never show that what happens when a person is influenced by all the things, by all the narrations, companies, other agents out there make about us. And so, yeah, it was at the same time shocking and fascinating.
Wow.
Incredible. Sorry, go ahead, Diana.
I'm sorry. I know I'm such a jumper inner. But you know, when you were talking though, I was like, wow, that sounds like family, like a family dynamic, you know? And reminded me of the 404 quilts, in the sense of that, like, yeah, there's this assimilation that takes place, and you've sort of like been able to visually see it when it's like something I feel like immigrants have held onto, at least in this country, for a really long time, this feeling of like, wait, who am I anymore? Someone else, your doppelganger, is telling you. I was like, wow, there's so many layers there. Thank you so much for sharing that. But I couldn't stop thinking about family when you were saying that.
And maybe to react on your quilts, when I was seeing them, I was also thinking about this necessity of being able to be paradoxical, or being made of small little pieces and coming together as one image. And I was wondering, is maybe a problem what we saw in the data is that they want to erase paradox, and that caricaturing her and pulling her in one direction to be one thing, one profitable thing. And I think the beauty of your quilts, or what it created in my mind, was these pieces, and how can we be pieces, and how can we be multiple thing in one image, and how can the digital age cope with that, and how does this work, as an open question, but yeah.
Thank you all for that. We actually have a question from the audience, I think, building upon this idea of change and how to change things. For anyone in the, this question comes from Lara. For anyone in the audience who works in the tech policy/advocacy space, where do we position activism? i.e., around the world, governments are passing new data protection laws and regulations, grappling with polarization and hate speech and content moderation. So how do we think about empowerment frameworks, agency, and action? I think some of you already discussed that in your answers, but yeah, any other observations, particularly for those in the policy space? Anyone can jump in from the panelists.
Okay, I'll be the jumper inner. So I think that policy it's looked at as the big change, but it's actually the very last thing that solidifies change. So where activism, and I think art also, falls in this is in the sense of empowerment, is actually dreaming and thinking and building of something completely different, bringing in the new, bringing in the ideas, the vision that can hold us all together in different ways. And it's that then policy from there seems to kind of, merge at some point. But, I've never seen policy be the first thing to happen. So it's always something that comes from the bottom up, even though we experience it as top down. I just want to lift that piece up.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for that. Do the other panelists have insights, also particularly those in academia as well?
I wanted to see, it's not about policy, but definitely builds on Diana's observation that policy tends to follow other social changes. And so one of the things we've been doing at the University of California, Davis, where I've been for the last 5 years, is developing a training program for people who are in the sciences and engineering to learn the racialized and biased histories of their own disciplines, so that they can think about the impact of what they're doing in this kind of longer historical framework. And it's been so inspiring to see people who are doing PhDs in engineering or computer science or the other sciences who haven't yet accommodated the expectations of funders, or especially the military. They haven't yet accommodated the expectations of academia. They still have these hopes and dreams for a world they can build with their skills, and to actually empower them with the knowledge of again, that sedimented history behind what is in the world, what's already given. And part of the way that we do that is through sharing the histories, but another part of the way that we do that is by opening up a sense of possibility through art, speculative fiction, where people are thinking about alternative worlds that could exist. And I just wanted to share that there are plenty of people who are getting technical training who have these dreams, and it's quite inspiring.
I just want to I think echo what a number of people have said now, and the beautiful example that Diana used of the turntable and the microphone. I think part of there is no definitive or sort of simple way of dealing with this, and I come back to the idea of agency, of for me, it's a challenge of producing and reproducing agency among people who are able to then act on some of these difficulties. So it's really gratifying to hear about, and for myself, part of the huge opportunity that we have. It's not, I can't think of many humanities programs around the world that have been sort of prioritized in the current climate. So we are profoundly aware of the rare moment that it is to be able to produce and build an arts program that is also trying to think about questions of technology. And I think art is a very powerful way of signaling agency and of igniting the imagination. I really like the idea of doing that and of working with across kind of the divides between arts and humanities and the sciences, and to find ways to make that conversation live in meaningful ways inside and outside the academy. So for me, the growth of activism is linked to, I guess, what people are directly concerned with, but it's also directed, it's also important to kind of engage activism in a way that multiplies critical thinking and people's sense of agency from whatever struggle they're coming from. And there's a wide range of ways one can think about that. So yeah, I just wanted to support that idea.
Mm-hmm. Maybe to add one experience from our work on Made to Measure, from the data experiment. What this experiment ended in was a website. Like, we built an interactive storytelling website, and the audience themselves, they can explore the story, and they're involved into the story, and they can also read certain parts of the data set themselves. Of course, that is a curated small part of the data, but there is, for example, a lack of data in the midst of these 5 years. And so we asked ourselves, what happened during this lack of data? Why is there suddenly a lack of data? And what happened in between? What explains that? And so, since we didn't find this out ourselves, we asked the audience to help us in this moment, and to also kind of read the data or part of the data themselves, and to speculate on that with us. And so what this moment enables, at least that's what we hope, is that the audience understands, okay, even if every spectator has the same set of data he or she can read, but the results, the ways they read it, will be completely different. So they suddenly, hopefully, find out that actually it's so important who reads the data, like with which perspective, which mindset behind. If you combine certain data in just a minimally different way, you get completely different results. And so what we hope, what this could do, is to make experienceable for the audience that it's so important who creates the algorithms. Like, what is the ideology implemented into the algorithms? What is the ideology of the developers, and also of the data analysts in a lot of cases? And in a lot of cases, they have a specific goal in mind, or like the algorithms are designed in a way that they have a certain result. So we hope that this like breaks this idea of the almighty AI analyzing the data in a very objective way, and when the AI spits out a certain result, a certain personality assessment, then this must be true, and if I see myself differently, then this must have to do with my personal biases or my cognitive impossibilities to see myself clearly. No, but to really like get that we are the storytellers. It's always us who read the data and not any kind of magic AI in the end. So we hope that this is kind of an empowerment in this actually on the first view, very shocking diagnosis of, oh yeah, they have so much data about us and they have all the technologies behind us, behind to make so many assumptions about us. But yeah, we can always break this narration. We can always correct it. We can always like claim that we have in the end the power to tell our narrations ourselves.
I love that, breaking the narration. So I had prepared a lot of questions, and I also wanted to hear more about what you meant by restitution, Valmont. But I also want to make space for this incredible panel, for each of the panelists, if you have questions for each other. So open floor if you all have questions for each other, because there's so many rich overlapping threads in everyone's work. And I feel like also it's one of those panels where you're like, I feel like we're all on the same page in a lot of ways.
Maybe then I'll start, and it's again for Diana, coming back to you often, but I made me extremely curious when you were talking about community work, and to already directly relate it back, I think when you started talking about obfuscation, and I mean, hiding yourself using gadgets, and this maybe also ties back to the question in the chat of what can we do? And what we noticed in our work is the person that gave her data never knew about data protection, not really. And most people who don't know it are then the victims of it. And of course, if we just work on obfuscation, we're not really, solving the problem. And I would be super curious about your experience on this. And if you have something, just this community work made me extremely curious. We could tell more about it.
Sure. Yeah, so the community work was a couple different things. It started with doing these little community events that we used to call discotheques, where it was like a potluck of people coming together with technology to teach each other technology. And at that point, it realized that like, oh, well, people are using things very differently, and how we're taught to use them is not necessarily how they end up being used in neighborhoods. So first it was like, let's tap into that, and while building community, kind of looking at how the way a community garden would support people in becoming like closer to the food source, but also build relationships while they were building the garden. So it was like, can we do that with media? And then the question moves to like, what is the role of media and technology in building new economies based in mutual aid? And that became a prevalent question right during the economic collapse here in Detroit. So thinking about big business, the big three going down, taking the whole city with them, the housing crisis, nothing protected us from, we're still building up. And just sort of thinking about the importance of localization. And that led to us building our own wireless networks and looking at mesh networks as a way of creating access and agency at the same time. So if people knew how the internet worked, then they could build it, and then they could be critical about it. And there were often times where people were very much concerned about what Comcast or AT&T thought, and that's where I had to pause. And they're like, is this legal? And it's like, yeah, it's legal. So that hesitation to me is something that I think my quilts are really pulling from. That's where the agency I think needs to be built, is that like, yeah, you can do something else. And then, what became really beautiful about that is we had all these networks around for years before like Vice picked us up and shared us right after net neutrality was repealed here in the US, and we became like poster children for net neutrality. And before that, I remember thinking how limited net neutrality was, because it just kind of hits the surface and there's this whole web of infrastructure that is unregulated outside of that. And so we started thinking deeply about, data sovereignty and what does it look like to have our own, like what's a neighborhood-based internet exchange point look like? How can that, what would that do for access? What would that do for people in figuring out what's possible with that type of connection or data? So I guess I hope that answers the question in the sense of what went down and all the kind of concerns that came up. But to me, it was just incredible to watch like 20-year-olds and 85-year-olds build the internet together because they were all very invested in it. And there was something there that really sprung to me, which is just like, wow, like we've hit this digital era. And when we hit the pandemic, it was like, boom, we're in it. But that agency is often targeted towards young people, and how important it was to also have elders as part of that building process was a major role in educating me in what kind of world, what digital world we need that can truly hold all of us. So hopefully that answers your question in a very long-winded way.
So inspiring to hear that story. Other questions for each other that the panelists might have?
I actually wanted to pick up your question for Valmont and just add my question onto it, which is about the distinction between restitution and decolonization, because I was, of course, really struck by the reminder that in South Africa, the university was designed as a tool of apartheid. And then thinking about this decolonizing project of asking ourselves, okay, what kind of ways of knowing and being were annihilated by the colonizing project, which is a question we have to care about if we work in universities. So I'd love to hear more about that distinction, restitution, decolonization.
Thank you. I should maybe have said earlier on that it's more I guess a worry about, and I'm not suggesting that it's happening here, but generally the word decolonization is sort of being neutralized and or overused. And I guess my response is coming from that place. And I like the concept of restitution because it's, the decolonization speaks about, it's almost like a kind of a detox. It's a taking away from something, but it's not clear what that process would involve. The restitution is a much more affirmative project, which, and so I guess the other part of it is to say that the experience of and it's peculiar maybe to the place where we are, but I don't think it is only that an act of restitution is also an act of institution building in this case. The archive that I'm talking about was created by the return of the anti-apartheid movement's records to the university where I'm at. There's a long story with it, but what that's got, in the 3 years that I've been working with a team to think about how to get this archive accessible again, to get it working with the stories of people who lived through the struggle, many of whom went into exile and so on, and to kind of re-establish its relevance for today's communities. It is important to think beyond simply the kind of pastness of the past. There was, in fact, with the story of the return of these collections, also the return of people into the country who had lived in exile, and there's an untold story about what happened. And all of this is now looking back at it with a different, I guess, with a different perspective on the past, because we become a bit more jaded. The Nelson Mandela moment was an incredible euphoric moment that lasted for a couple of decades. But it is also clear that we're living in a time of profound disappointment now and frustration, where many of the problems that were sort of swept under the carpet in that peaceful transition, that created the Rainbow Nation, are are with us now in amplified form. And in fact, the whole idea of a rainbow nation is, for younger people in this country, it simply doesn't sell anymore. And so we need a different kind of, we almost need a different social agreement about how we're going to get out of the mess. And I think it's, well, we're also not the only ones in this mess. I think we sort of, COVID has shown us that we all have our dirty business to deal with. And some of it we have in common and others is unique. So I guess the project, when I speak of restitution, I'm deliberately putting it out there as a word that could signify both the return of a kind of cultural value to communities, but also the return, and this is why I guess I come to this concept of infrastructure as it's used in the digital domain, which I think is potentially very helpful, because it's not just about the human and it's not just about the machine, it's about the ways in which we mobilize that set of dynamic. There's a beautiful new book by a historian called Dipesh Chakrabarty, who it's talking about history and I forget the name of the book, but it's talking about history, or the kind of register in which we think about history and the register in which we think about the planetary. And he's saying there's one of the important concepts in trying to understand, I mean, people think of it variously as the Anthropocene and the planetary and so on, is that we are now in a stage where the biological and the ecological and the technical are all intertwined with each other, and it's an egg that can't be unscrambled. And in a sense, we need to kind of make better use of the kind of dilemma that it throws up for us. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I guess the point I wanted to make about restitution is that it can't just be the return of objects. It's got to be the return of, or the re-establishment of some kind of set of practices that help to make sense of the objects that are putatively being returned. I don't know if that answers your questions.
Thank you so much for that. And as we wrap up this conversation, also, you know, any other questions that the panelists have for each other?
I would love to ask Kalindi about your maps that you shared. And sorry if this is a naive question, but if it wasn't slavery that was being transported, would there be a different outcome?
I might have to ask you a follow-up, but I sometimes use another map in place of that one, which shows not only the slave trade, but also other goods and commodities that were being circulated at the same time, not necessarily by the same ships, but at the same time. And it comes down to this kind of a similar conclusion, which is, it's not that the relationships of power extraction and exploitation that we're observing through digital technologies is somehow innovative in the worst sense, right? It's not like these are necessarily completely new ways of like data extraction, data mining. These aren't necessarily new ways of taking value away from people who can't necessarily or don't know to protect themselves. It's just that the idea of the commodity or what is labor is being translated differently. And so the map is meant to show like the really material lineage there. So the cables that were laid for telegraphy were already there to connect points of commercial importance in the British Empire. And so the fiber optic cables were laid in the same places because the original ones were already there, but those power relations and the relationships between metropoles and former colonies, but also intra-relationships between basically points in this proto-globalized labor economy were already there. And so that's what the map is meant to show. It's, and if it hadn't been, commodified people, if it hadn't been commodified nature, resources, et cetera, would the map look different? And I think because what it's actually mapping is technologies that follow power relations and market relations, that the answer is it might have looked slightly different, but it's mapping more those relationships than it even is what's being carried, I think. Does that answer what you're asking?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for taking the time to do that.
Any other questions for each other?
One more question. Oh, no more. You go.
Go
No, you go.
Maybe a follow-up question on that. Like for our former film, The Cleaners, we dealt with outsourced labor. And in this case, it was content moderation, which was outsourced by companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others. In this case, to the Philippines, where tens of thousands of people like sit in front of computers every day to sort out all the images and videos and texts in a lot of cases also, which are uploaded there and which are like sorted by algorithms beforehand. So this is kind of a form of, I would argue it is also a very clear abuse of people, but in most cases you can't prove the wounds this labor causes. The effects this labor shows in a lot of cases only become visible, or not even that, like years after, like when the people are already fired and they can never like give any proof that this has anything to do with the work themselves. Like where do we categorize this form of abuse? Like this is not just a singular example. In more and more cases we will have to do now with work in front of screens. Images can become very cruel for the people who have to watch them. Like how do we measure those effects, and how do we how do we give agency to the people who have to suffer from this kind of abuse? It's an open question.
Well, when I was interrupting you earlier, the thing I was going to ask was the role of therapy in this work, especially, when you all were working with the doubles and everyone having conversation and minds being blown. And then listening to what you were just saying, I'm like, I think we have a new sector of therapy that is emerging or that is needed. That's like a complete, like just unpredictable kind of effect of tech that is a little sad, but I'm just, there's nothing other than a comment in that. Where's the therapy?
Mm-hmm.
I will say it does seem like therapy is also being automated as well, which is the terrifying layers. And also someone who works at this tech company was telling me there's now like startups that are therapy startups specifically for tech workers. And so if you're a tech worker, like you can only see a therapist at this particular company. Instead of actually going out to find like, a therapist in the broader world.
And in the case of our, like the companies, the outsourcing companies we researched on in the Philippines, in a lot of cases, like they were told by Google, by Facebook, by Twitter and others to take care of their contractors and to provide them with a therapist if they need one, but it was never like properly checked. And of course, they could like argue that they had asked them to provide psychological help, but like there was no agency there, and like it's so hard. Like, can we kind of invent a new law maybe from our side that companies are held responsible for their outsourcing companies as well? And I think there are some new impulses like this, but of course it's legally it's probably quite hard to really follow this whole line of outsourcing, because it's of course so globalized and there are so many players in between.
Thank you all so much for these reflections, and I feel like that is a really provocative note to end on. We'll give a second for any burning comments, reflections, things that people really want to say before we end.
I think from it's just to say that I've found this conversation extremely inspiring. It's been great to get to know a little bit of your work. I sort of find myself in a situation where I'm an advocate for thinking about tech, and so it's great to know that there are others out there who are kind of doing the same kind of work, or parallel or similar kind of work. So yeah, thank you for arranging this, and I really appreciate the work that you do.
Yeah, can just give it back exactly like that.
Thank you so much, everyone, and onward into a new year of continuing this inspiring work. Thank you all for your inspiring research, your art, your community organizing, and thank you to the Goethe Institute for organizing all of this. All right, take care, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.